President Trump, Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, and Ambassador to the UN Nikki Haley each spoke out about North Korea and its leader.
Mr. President, will you attack North Korea?
We have many military options, and the President wanted to be briefed on each one of them. Any threat to the United States or its territories, including Guam, or our allies, will be met with a massive military response, a response both effective and overwhelming. We are not looking to the total annihilation of a country, namely North Korea. But as I said, we have many options to do so.
To the members of the Security Council, I must say, enough is enough. We have taken an incremental approach, and despite the best of intentions, it has not worked. His abusive use of missiles and his nuclear threats show that he is begging for war.
Richard Haass, we'll get to those comments in a minute. Those were the comments that were choreographed and the sort of comments you would expect during this sort of crisis. But what the diplomatic world is talking about, certainly what our allies in South Korea are talking about this morning, are the attacks the President of the United States made on the South Koreans, suggesting that they were appeasing the North Koreans, and also talking about, inexplicably, starting a trade war with the South Koreans at the very moment that they are at risk of an all-out hot war that could cost millions of lives on the peninsula. Sort through that for us.
Well, it's a sign that the national security process, which is designed to make sure something like this doesn't happen, is not working, because all focus ought to be on collaborating and cooperating with South Korea against North Korea. One of North Korea's principal strategic aims is to split the United States from South Korea.
But this would be, just for people that are just tuning in now about Korea, this would be like FDR attacking Germany in the fall of 1939, right before the air blitz on London, the Battle of Britain. Why would we attack a long-standing ally on the eve of a possible war?
Well, the answer is we shouldn't be. And there's already enough tension in the U.S.-South Korean relationship. Think about it. What they care most about, Joe, is maintaining peace and stability on the peninsula. Up to recently, that was enough for us, too. But now, we're worried that North Korea poses a threat to us directly. So there's a structural tension between the United States and its close ally in Seoul. So we don't want to be adding fuel to that fire. Instead, what we want to figure out is, can we come up with a common stance against North Korea that's hell-bent on developing a large nuclear arsenal with missiles able to deliver those nuclear weapons around the world?
Well, you're speaking logically, but David Ignatius, how can you be adopting a common stance when you have the President of the United States this weekend actually accusing the South Koreans of appeasement, and at the same time, on a completely different point, talking about a nationalistic trade war with his country that's literally on the cutting edge of what could be a nuclear confrontation? Have you heard any explanation of the President's words this weekend that could legitimize what he said, or at least begin to explain his thought process?
No, Joe, I think this is a president who's frustrated, who's angry at allies, who's angry really at the failure of his own policy. We have to remember that in moving last weekend to test, we believe, a hydrogen bomb to significantly escalate the confrontation between the United States and North Korea, Kim Jong-un rebuffed a very direct diplomatic opening from the United States, from the President himself and from Secretary of State Tillerson, in effect inviting them into negotiations, crediting them for being restrained over the last several weeks prior to the test in not making additional tests. And Kim Jong-un has blown right through that. The scenario the U.S. was carefully drafting, State Department officials were describing in private, in detail, where they thought this was going. Last weekend shattered that. So president, I think, is now scrambling he always reacts impulsively, I think, to new developments. He had a long conversation Monday night, South Korean time, with South Korean President Moon. So the rhetoric of appeasement, the threats of trade war, I think were put in a separate category. And there's now intensive discussion, I'm told, behind the scenes about new diplomatic efforts centering on China, centering on a much tougher effort by China and the United Nations to increase pressure. So far, we have to say the effect of pressure has only been to make North Korea rush faster toward this nuclear capability, and the truth is they are now a nuclear state.
So, Richard, David sort of led me to my question to you, which is this comment yesterday from Nikki Haley at the UN, where she said the time for half measures is over, enough is enough. What is left to do that hasn't been done over the last decade in terms of sanctions? Nobody wants to go to the military option. If you've done almost all you can in terms of sanctions, what's left somewhere in the middle there that hasn't been tried? And if it hasn't been, why hasn't it been tried over 10 years?
The short answer is not a lot is left. You can try to cut down everything going in physically, all the oil, but North Korea has already begun to stockpile oil. You could try to cut off every financial flow. But I think the history of sanctions, Willie, shows that won't work. There'll always be outliers who will get in there. There's black markets, there's gray markets. North Korea also is the most closed society in the world. They're willing to have their people starve, if need be,
they don't care
in order to support their nuclear program. So sanctions aren't the answer.
So is it a military response or nothing?
I think we're down to a binary choice. At some point, things get simple, and now it's down to a binary choice. Either we learn to manage or live with a North Korea that has nuclear weapons on missiles, and that's some combination of deterrence, missile defense. We add military forces to the region. Maybe we say we'll use military force if they get a missile ready to launch, or we launch, as H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor, was talking about, a preventive strike. We simply say this has now reached an intolerable point, and when we use words like intolerable or unacceptable, we're going to do something. Obviously, that has all the risks of starting a second Korean War.
Richard, let's cut through this for a second. I mean, there is the military option. I mean, let's just strip it down. And this actually has been the reality for years now. There's either a military option or there's acceptance of North Korea as a nuclear state.
Right, it's binary. We've basically
it's binary. So where is the foreign policy community in the United States of America?
I think most of the foreign policy community is saying as bad as this is, we can live with it, we can manage it through missile defense, through deterrence, and so forth.
So let's talk about what that means. That means the foreign policy community is saying we can live with Kim Jong-un having the capability of delivering a nuclear warhead right now, to Seattle, to Portland, to San Francisco, and to Los Angeles.
Again, it's not a single community. I think a lot of foreign policy experts are saying.
But that is a choice.
That is a choice. And what I think they're underestimating is right now he's probably at a point or close to a point where he could attack several American cities. What they haven't dealt with, I think, is the reality that in 5 or 10 years, he could pose a threat to American society. Imagine he had 25 or 50 nuclear weapons on ballistic missiles that could reach the United States.
David Ignatius, imagine that he decides to sell this nuclear technology to ISIS. Imagine that he decides to sell this nuclear technology somewhere else. I mean, I am certainly not advocating anything right now. What I am saying, David, is what's been the reality that people have not really been willing to strip it down to, that's been facing us now for a year or two. It certainly was facing Barack Obama, and he knew Donald Trump would face it when he turned the White House over to him. You either accept North Korea as a nuclear power with the capability of nuking Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Portland, and selling nuclear weapons to ISIS, or you have a military response. There's not really any middle ground. And all this talk about sanctions really is just nonsensical. It will not matter to a man who would starve tens of millions of people to have a nuclear bomb.
With all due respect to my friend Richard Haass, I'm always wary when people describe things as binary choices. You either go to war or you do nothing. the way it ends up being framed. And the reality is there are always lots of intermediate options along the way. It is true that Kim Jong-un has introduced in his regime a very unstable new factor in the region and also globally, his ability to proliferate in a way that we haven't seen. His ability to blackmail neighbors, flying a missile over Japan, terrifying the Japanese people, was the most recent example of this. So I think the question really is, action is going to be taken to deal with this threat. The idea of simply accommodating it, I really don't see that on the table. But what? And what on a fairly wide menu of possible next steps are officials considering? I thought we heard a little bit of that from Secretary of Defense Mattis, the coolest head in this crowd, really, saying if North Korea attacks us, it will be met with a massive response, but then stressing that the U.S. prefers diplomatic outcomes. There are a lot of tools in our military arsenal that are never talked about, that involve subtle ways to make systems not work, to missiles that take off don't go very far. That bag of military tricks, I'm sure, is being examined, even expanded by this administration. Right. But I think the idea that it's one or the other, I'd be careful of that.
So, John, we had Richard talking about deterrence. You can do the military option, or you can continue to deter North Korea in some way. It's not clear to most people who watch North Korea that Kim Jong-un is a man who can be deterred by conventional means. What does it even mean to deter North Korea at this point?
Look, this to me is a fundamental question that I don't have an answer to. I'm going to turn the question around to a couple of people who know more than I do. But we lived in an era of deterrence throughout the Cold War, and particularly with the USSR, right? Deterrence has worked, broadly speaking, in the nuclear age in a lot of places where we've had enemies who have threatened us in a more systemic way than North Korea does. But it has always been premised on the notion that the people who ran the countries we were deterring were fundamentally rational. I've heard a lot of debate over particularly the last couple of months around this question, Richard and David, about whether this leader is a rational leader or not. And even in this conversation, Richard, you made the point about, well, he's perfectly willing to starve tens of millions of his people under the circumstances of sanctions. That, under normal circumstances, is someone who's not considered rational. Now, I ask the question pointedly now, is this a person who is rational enough for whom, rational enough for deterrence to be a plausible strategy?
Again, big debate. This is the single hardest intelligence target for the United States, the most closed country in the world to discern. You'd have to make a calculation. There's no guarantee. Someone doesn't sign something and say, I can be deterred. It may also be that he wants to use the nuclear weapons to give himself protection, so we don't do things. You look what happened to Ukraine when they gave up their nuclear weapons. So there's that school of thought that it's defensive. Another school of thought is offensive. He wants to have this as a shield. This way we can't put too much pressure on him, so he can, among other things, potentially use military force against a South Korea or Japan, or he could sell something. The answer is we don't know. Right. Foreign policy is going to be about making a big decision, really consequential here, with imperfect knowledge, and we're going to simply have to look at what risks we're willing to take, and there's going to be risks of action and there's going to be risks of inaction, whichever way we go. There's no neat, perfect answer here.
So let me just ask the question to David. David, what do Jim Mattis, Rex Tillerson, McMaster, the rest of them, what do they think about the rationality of this North Korean leader?
That has been the biggest intelligence challenge for this administration, arguably as for the one before. Understanding what makes Kim Jong-un take the decisions he does. In a sense, Kim Jong-un has already long deterred South Korea from taking any action, has deterred the U.S. by his array of conventional weapons, the missiles poised at Seoul that would take out Seoul if there was any attempt to interfere with him. There is a view that he deeply wants a meeting with President Trump, with the United States president, that's what he's rushing toward. President Trump has tried to signal he's prepared to do that. I think that's not the last we've heard of that possibility. Finally, the issue that I hear everyone talking about is what is it that China might do beyond what it's doing now to prevent the possibility of a war on the Korean Peninsula, which becomes much more serious as we go down this road. Would the Chinese consider cutting off oil exports to North Korea? That would be a very dramatic step. I know that's being discussed. My sources tell me that the Chinese leadership in the last month at their vacation retreat talked about that and other tougher moves. So, but we have a lot of countries that are going to have to face decisions they didn't want to face, like
Right.
China.
So as we talk about these two leaders, and then Mattis and Tillerson and Kelly, the only problem is when you talk about the rationality of the leaders, and a lot of this conversation, I honestly did not know which leader you were talking about, whether it was Trump or the North Korean leader. And that's the sort of the elephant in the room, that we are dealing with a president that some might argue is very hungry for war, or is hungry to make unhinged decisions. And I'm not sure how much influence our foreign policy leaders have over that ultimately when a decision is made. You remember over a year ago, General Hayden saying on our show that it was quick. It's quick when it happens. So
thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.